I was only 14 when they told me I'd become his seventh wife. Isabella's voice trembled as she recounted the moment her childhood ended. Born into a small Mormon settlement in the late 1800s, she never questioned the path laid before her until the prophet's weathered hand selected her from among her peers. What followed was a descent into a hidden world of polygamous marriages, where young girls became property and mothers before they could understand what either meant. This is the shocking true story of the concubines of the early Mormon settlements, the forgotten women whose stories have been buried beneath layers of religious devotion and historical revision. In the isolated valleys of Utah Territory, far from prying eyes and federal laws, communities founded on religious devotion harbored dark secrets behind closed doors. Young girls like Isabella were raised from birth to understand their ultimate purpose, becoming plural wives to men often 3 or 4 times their age. The preparation began early, with mothers teaching daughters to be obedient, quiet, and pleasing to their future husbands. By age 12, most girls understood they would soon be called to fulfill their divine purpose as vessels for bringing spirits into the mortal world. What outsiders might view as child marriage, the community celebrated as sacred covenant. The girls themselves rarely questioned these arrangements, having been surrounded since birth by sister wives and multiple mothers. Isabella, however, was different. Even as a child, she noticed the hollow eyes of the youngest wives, the way they flinched when called to their husband's bedroom, how they aged decades in just a few years. The practice of plural marriage wasn't merely a religious doctrine. It was a carefully orchestrated system of control. Men with the most wives gained the most status, with top leaders accumulating dozens of spiritual brides. The girls were typically selected between ages 14 and 16, though some as young as 12 were sealed to particularly powerful elders. These unions were rarely about romance or companionship, but rather about establishing divine kingdoms in the afterlife, where a man's glory was measured by his progeny. The settlements were structured to maintain secrecy and compliance, with outsiders kept at a distance and troublemakers swiftly punished. Settlements were often established in remote locations, with natural barriers providing protection from government intervention. Family compounds were designed with multiple small attached houses, allowing a man to visit each wife while maintaining the appearance of separate households. Communal activities reinforced the system, with public praise for prolific mothers and subtle shaming for those who questioned the practice. Isabella still remembers the day she became the prophet's property, dressed in a simple white dress sewn by her mother's trembling hands. "You're blessed among women," they told her, as though being chosen by a 65-year-old man was the highest honor a 14-year-old girl could receive. The ceremony took place at midnight in the settlement's temple, a ritual shrouded in secrecy to avoid detection by federal authorities who had outlawed polygamy decades earlier. Isabella stood frozen as ancient words bound her to a stranger, her parents beaming with pride from the front row. What should have been a childhood filled with learning and play became overnight a life of domestic servitude and forced intimacy. The prophet's first wife, Emma, a woman with eyes like shattered glass, presented Isabella with her new clothing. High-necked, ankle-length dresses in drab colors designed to hide any hint of femininity. "Modesty protects your virtue," Emma explained, though Isabella's virtue was already forfeit to the man who now owned her body and soul. The hierarchy among sister wives was strictly maintained, with first wives wielding considerable power over newer additions to the family. For Isabella, this meant navigating a complex web of jealousies, alliances, and subtle power struggles within the prophet's household. The senior wives assigned the youngest the most difficult household tasks, from scrubbing floors to laundering the family's extensive clothing by hand. While publicly preaching sisterly unity, behind closed doors the competition for the husband's favor created an atmosphere of constant tension. Isabella learned quickly that survival depended on forming alliances with certain sister wives while avoiding the wrath of others. The first wife, Emma, maintained her position through a combination of piety and intimidation, frequently reminding the younger wives that she alone held the prophet's heart. Middle wives competed for resources and attention, often using their children as leverage to gain favor. The newest and youngest wives, like Isabella, occupied the lowest rung, expected to show gratitude for their blessed position while enduring the greatest hardships. Daily life for plural wives followed strict routines designed to maintain order in the chaotic household. Rising before dawn, Isabella joined the other wives in prayer before beginning morning chores. Meals were prepared communally, but eaten according to status, with the prophet dining with his favorite wife of the moment while others ate in the kitchen or separate quarters. Childcare was shared among the women, with older wives supervising younger ones in raising the prophet's numerous offspring. Isabella found some comfort in caring for the children, many of whom were closer to her in age than she was to her husband. Education for girls consisted primarily of domestic training, cooking, cleaning, gardening, and childcare, preparing them for their predetermined roles as plural wives. Religious instruction emphasized submission and sacrifice, with daily readings focusing on biblical and Book of Mormon passages about obedient women, while boys received more formal education to prepare them for leadership roles. Girls were taught only what would make them useful in the home. The most dreaded aspect of plural marriage came with the night duty, when a wife was summoned to the prophet's private chambers. Isabella learned of this system on her wedding night, when Emma handed her a wooden token with her name carved into it. "When he places your token in the box on the mantel, you'll know it's your night," Emma explained without meeting her eyes. For the youngest wives, these summons brought fear and confusion rather than marital intimacy. Isabella spent her first weeks as a wife, praying her token would remain untouched, watching with relief each morning when the prophet selected another name. But eventually, her night came, and with it, a loss of innocence that no child should endure. What happened behind those closed doors was never discussed among the wives, though the sounds from the prophet's chamber sometimes echoed through the thin walls of the compound. In the morning, wives would return to their duties with downcast eyes, some bearing bruises they attributed to clumsiness when asked. Pregnancy quickly followed for most young wives, with childbearing beginning long before their bodies were fully developed. The settlement celebrated these pregnancies as blessings, ignoring the dangerous medical realities of children bearing children. Isabella watched as girls barely 15 struggled through difficult deliveries without proper medical care, many developing complications that would affect them for life. A wife's status often rose with each successful birth, particularly if she produced sons, creating incentive to bear as many children as possible despite the physical toll. The prophet's compound included a birthing room where the settlement's midwife attended deliveries, often assisted by the other wives. Complications were common: hemorrhaging, infections, and birth injuries that were treated with herbal remedies and prayer rather than modern medicine. Young mothers like Isabella were expected to recover quickly and return to household duties, often while nursing newborns. Children were considered communal property of the marriage, with biological mothers sometimes separated from their offspring if the prophet deemed another wife more suitable for raising certain children. Health concerns were rampant in these closed communities, where intermarriage and limited medical knowledge created dangerous conditions for women and children. The settlements rejected outside medical care as worldly interference, relying instead on folk remedies and spiritual healing. Isabella witnessed countless preventable tragedies: young mothers dying in childbirth, infants lost to diseases easily treated in the outside world, and chronic conditions that went unaddressed. The physical demands of constant pregnancy, beginning in adolescence, left many plural wives with permanent health issues including prolapsed uteruses, chronic pain, and hormonal disorders. Malnutrition was common, as food was distributed according to status, with youngest wives and their children often receiving less than their share. Mental health suffered equally, with depression and anxiety prevalent among plural wives who had no outlet for their feelings and no escape from their circumstances. Isabella noted how many wives developed vacant expressions over time, a defensive disconnection from unbearable reality. The psychological control mechanisms used to maintain the polygamous system were sophisticated and pervasive. From early childhood, girls were conditioned to view plural marriage as their divine destiny and only path to salvation. The isolated nature of the settlements meant limited exposure to alternative viewpoints or lifestyles, creating a closed information system. Religious teachings emphasized that questioning leaders was equivalent to questioning God, effectively silencing doubts or concerns. Isabella recalled weekly sermons where disobedient wives were publicly shamed, with cautionary tales about women who fled only to face divine punishment in the outside world. The concept of blood atonement, that certain sins could only be forgiven through the shedding of the sinner's blood, created an atmosphere of fear and compliance. Wives were encouraged to report on each other's behavior, fragmenting potential solidarity among women who might otherwise have supported each other. Love was redefined as obedience, with natural human emotions like jealousy or desire for autonomy labeled as spiritual weaknesses to be overcome. Resistance within the system carried severe consequences, as Isabella discovered when she befriended Sarah, a 16-year-old third wife who openly questioned the prophet's authority. What began as whispered conversations away from prying ears escalated when Sarah refused her husband's advances, claiming illness when summoned for night duty. The punishment was swift and designed to make an example. Sarah was publicly denounced in the settlement's Sunday gathering, labeled as influenced by evil spirits, and isolated in a small outbuilding with minimal food and water. Isabella was forbidden from speaking to her friend, but secretly brought her water and food when possible, witnessing Sarah's deterioration over weeks of purification. When Sarah finally emerged, she was a shell of her former self, eyes downcast and spirit broken. She never questioned authority again, and within months was pregnant with her first child. Isabella learned the crucial lesson: survival meant at least outward compliance, with resistance forced underground. Behind the public face of religious devotion, the reality of these marriages included widespread abuse that went unchallenged and unreported. The age difference between husbands and their youngest wives created inherent power imbalances that enabled exploitation. Physical discipline was considered a husband's right, with wives expected to submit to correction for perceived failings. Isabella witnessed sister wives with unexplained bruises and broken bones attributed to accidents, with the community turning a blind eye to obvious abuse. Sexual coercion was built into the system, with wives having no right to refuse their husbands regardless of their own desires or well-being. The concept of marital rape didn't exist in these communities, where a wife's body was considered her husband's property to use as he wished. Emotional abuse was perhaps the most pervasive, with tactics including favoritism, isolation, gaslighting, and threats of abandonment in this life or damnation in the next. Children were not spared, with harsh physical punishment common and little protection from predatory adults in positions of authority. For young women like Isabella, education about their own bodies was deliberately limited, keeping them ignorant of basic reproductive knowledge. What little information they received was shrouded in religious language that emphasized their role as vessels for bringing spirits into mortality. Menstruation was explained as preparation for motherhood, with no discussion of women's health or normal developmental changes. Sexual education consisted primarily of instructions to submit to your husband and be fruitful, with no preparation for the realities of intimate relations. Isabella recalled her confusion and fear on her wedding night, having no understanding of what would happen beyond vague references to wifely duties. This deliberate ignorance extended to pregnancy and childbirth, with young wives often not understanding how they became pregnant or what to expect during delivery. The settlement's midwife provided minimal information, focusing on spiritual preparation rather than medical knowledge. This systemic denial of basic health education contributed to high maternal and infant mortality rates and preventable complications that affected women throughout their lives. The outside world remained a mystery to most plural wives, who were permitted limited contact with non-members or even relatives who had left the faith. Information was carefully controlled, with approved religious texts forming the basis of all education. Newspapers, magazines, and books from outside were prohibited as corrupting influences, while radio and later television were banned entirely. Isabella's knowledge of the broader world came primarily through carefully edited accounts and sermons that portrayed outsiders as wicked persecutors threatening their way of life. Government authorities were described as enemies seeking to destroy their families and imprison their husbands, creating fear of anyone representing official institutions. This isolation served a dual purpose: preventing outside interference and limiting wives' awareness of alternatives to their current situation. Travel beyond the settlement's boundaries required permission and escorts, ensuring that wives couldn't easily flee even if they wanted to. Contact with outsiders was always supervised, preventing private conversations that might introduce forbidden ideas or offer assistance. The economic structure of these polygamous communities further entrenched women's dependence on their husbands and the broader religious system. Plural wives had no independent income or property rights, with all assets controlled by their husband or the church leadership. Isabella's labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare, gardening, sewing, created value, but earned her no financial independence or security. The United Order practiced in many of these settlements required members to consecrate all property to the church, which then redistributed resources according to perceived worthiness and need. In practice, this meant leaders and their families enjoyed relative comfort, while lower-status families struggled with inadequate housing, food, and clothing. Young wives were particularly vulnerable, entirely dependent on their husband's goodwill for basic necessities. Without education, job skills, or resources, leaving the community meant facing near-certain poverty and hardship. This economic reality served as a powerful deterrent to escape, particularly for mothers unwilling to abandon their children to destitution. Hidden beneath the surface of daily life ran networks of resistance and mutual aid among the plural wives, creating small spaces of autonomy within the oppressive system. Isabella discovered these networks gradually, beginning with small acts of kindness from older wives who slipped extra food to undernourished children or taught useful skills beyond basic domestic duties. Secret knowledge passed between trusted women, which wild plants could prevent pregnancy, which leaders might look the other way if rules were bent, which families on the outside might help a woman fleeing abuse. While outwardly conforming, these women maintained inner lives and connections that the patriarchal structure couldn't fully control. Isabella learned to recognize the subtle signs of resistance, certain phrases with double meanings, seemingly innocent gatherings that served as covers for exchanging forbidden information, small acts of defiance disguised as religious devotion. These underground networks provided emotional support and practical assistance that helped many wives endure otherwise unbearable conditions and occasionally facilitated escapes when situations became too dangerous. For some plural wives, escape became the only option despite the tremendous risks involved. Isabella witnessed several attempts during her years in the prophet's household, some successful, but many ending in capture and harsh consequences. The most memorable was 19-year-old Rebecca, who fled with her infant daughter after particularly brutal treatment from both her husband and senior wives. Isabella helped by creating a distraction while Rebecca slipped away during a community gathering, carrying only a small bundle of necessities and the savings she'd secretly accumulated from selling handmade quilts. The settlement mobilized immediately upon discovering her absence, with men on horseback searching surrounding areas, while sermons denounced her as influenced by Satan. When Rebecca wasn't found within 3 days, the prophet announced she had surely met a terrible fate in the wilderness, a divine punishment for her disobedience. Years later, a traveling merchant whispered to Isabella that Rebecca had made it to California and started a new life, though she'd never been able to return for her other children left behind. This knowledge sustained Isabella through her darkest days, proof that another life was possible, however difficult to achieve. The legal status of plural marriage created complex challenges for these communities and the women within them. Following the 1862 Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act and subsequent legislation, polygamy was officially outlawed in U.S. territories, forcing these marriages underground. Isabella's own union was never legally recognized, making her effectively an unwed mother in the eyes of the law, simultaneously leaving her unprotected by marriage laws while making her vulnerable to prosecution as an accomplice to illegal polygamy. The community developed elaborate systems to evade legal scrutiny, with official documentation showing only first wives as legally married, while others were listed as housekeepers or extended family. When government officials investigated, communities would temporarily disperse, with plural families separating until the danger passed. This legal limbo created additional vulnerabilities for plural wives, who had no legal claim to property, inheritance, or even custody of their own children if they left the marriage. Without birth certificates, legal marriage licenses, or official identities, women who escaped faced significant challenges establishing themselves in mainstream society, often unable to prove their own existence on paper. Children born into these polygamous households faced their own unique struggles, growing up in environments where normal family structures were inverted and distorted. Isabella became particularly protective of the children in her household, especially the girls who would likely face the same future she had. Boys and girls were raised differently from early childhood, with gender roles strictly enforced through daily activities and responsibilities. Sons of high-ranking men received preferential treatment and education, groomed for future leadership positions, while daughters were prepared for plural marriage and motherhood. Children often developed confused attachments, with dozens of siblings competing for limited parental attention and resources. Biological mothers were sometimes prevented from showing special affection for their own children, as all children were considered equally the father's offspring. Isabella observed how this system created lasting emotional wounds, children struggling to form healthy relationships, uncertain of their place in the family hierarchy, and often repeating the patterns they'd been raised with. Particularly heartbreaking were the young boys who weren't selected for leadership, often expelled from the community on flimsy pretexts to reduce competition for young brides. As federal pressure intensified in the late 19th century, many polygamous communities adapted by going further underground or establishing remote settlements beyond easy government reach. Isabella's community relocated several times during her early years as a plural wife, each move taking them to increasingly isolated locations. The 1890 Manifesto officially ended the Mormon Church's sanctioning of plural marriage, creating a schism between mainstream Mormons and fundamentalist groups determined to continue the practice. Isabella's settlement aligned with the fundamentalists, condemning the main church for abandoning sacred principles under government pressure. These splinter groups developed increasingly extreme interpretations of religious texts to justify continued polygamy, with leaders claiming direct divine authority that superseded both church hierarchy and civil law. Isabella watched as her community grew progressively more isolated, with stricter rules, harsher punishments for infractions, and increased suspicion of outsiders. Travel was restricted, mail was monitored, and contact with non-believing relatives was severed completely. This isolation made outside intervention nearly impossible, and escape increasingly difficult, with the outside world portrayed as so corrupt and dangerous that many wives became too frightened to consider leaving despite their suffering. The psychological impact of being raised to become a plural wife left lasting scars on girls like Isabella, affecting their development and sense of self-worth. From earliest childhood, girls received constant messaging about their subordinate status and predetermined role as one of many wives. Personal ambitions, individual talents, and natural curiosity were systematically discouraged in favor of conformity and domestic skills. Isabella recalled childhood dreams of becoming a teacher, quickly suppressed when she shared them with her mother.
"Your highest calling is motherhood," she was told, though motherhood in her community meant sharing a husband and raising children in competition with sister wives.
Young girls were discouraged from forming close friendships that might later compete with loyalty to their husband, creating a profound isolation that persisted into adulthood. The natural adolescent development of identity and independence was actively thwarted, with normal teenage questioning labeled as dangerous rebellion requiring correction. By the time most girls reached marriage age, they had internalized their role so completely that many couldn't imagine alternatives, their sense of self entirely defined by their position as a wife and mother within the polygamous structure. Life for elderly plural wives revealed the long-term consequences of the system, as Isabella observed in the oldest women of the settlement. After decades of childbearing and hard physical labor, these women often suffered from chronic health problems without adequate medical care. Their status in the community depended largely on their continuing usefulness and the positions their sons had achieved. Those with powerful sons maintained some comfort and respect, while those who had borne primarily daughters, or whose sons had left the community, often faced neglect. Particularly heartbreaking were wives who had fallen from favor decades earlier and never regained their husband's attention or support. Without retirement provisions or social security, elderly wives depended entirely on family charity, creating anxiety about aging and illness. Isabella noticed how some older women became increasingly rigid in enforcing traditions on younger wives, perhaps compensating for their diminishing power by controlling those below them in the hierarchy. Others developed a quiet wisdom and compassion, secretly helping younger wives navigate the system with minimal harm. The outside world's perception of plural marriage often missed the complex reality experienced by women within these closed communities. When outsiders occasionally investigated, they saw only what the community wanted them to see: smiling women professing contentment with their chosen lifestyle, clean and well-behaved children, and peaceful religious devotion. Isabella witnessed numerous instances where investigators were skillfully misdirected, shown carefully prepared households, and interviewed only selected wives coached on appropriate responses. The true conditions, the physical and emotional abuse, the child brides, the coercion and control, remained hidden behind a carefully constructed facade. Media portrayals alternated between sensationalized accounts focusing on sexual aspects of polygamy, and oversimplified narratives of religious freedom, rarely capturing the nuanced reality of daily life for plural wives. Isabella felt particularly frustrated by outside feminists who condemned plural wives as willing participants in their own oppression, without understanding the lifelong conditioning, limited options, and genuine religious beliefs that complicated these women's situations. This misunderstanding from both critics and defenders of polygamy further isolated women like Isabella, who found few outsiders capable of comprehending their experiences. The stories of women who successfully escaped these polygamous communities revealed both the immense challenges they faced and remarkable resilience. During her years as a plural wife, Isabella collected these accounts like precious gems, each one reinforcing the possibility of another life. There was Martha, who fled with 3 children after secretly saving money for years, eventually becoming a nurse in Colorado. Rebecca, who escaped after memorizing the route to the nearest town during rare supervised trips and walked 40 miles through wilderness with her infant son. Sarah, who gained her husband's permission to visit a cousin and never returned, sending for her children years later when she had established herself. What these stories shared were careful planning, tremendous courage, and the painful reality that most escaping women had to leave some or all of their children behind, at least temporarily. The aftermath brought different challenges: adjusting to mainstream society, overcoming limited education and job skills, building healthy relationships after years of psychological conditioning, and managing the guilt and grief of separated families. Yet these women's stories also showed remarkable adaptation and growth, with many eventually creating fulfilling lives that would have been impossible within the polygamous system. The psychological trauma of life as a plural wife created lasting effects that many women carried throughout their lives, even after escaping. Isabella observed patterns among those who managed to leave, including her close friend Mary, who fled 3 years before Isabella's own escape. Survivors commonly struggled with complex PTSD symptoms, hypervigilance, flashbacks, emotional numbness, and difficulty trusting others. Having been conditioned to seek permission for basic decisions, many former plural wives found independent decision-making overwhelming at first. Relationships proved particularly challenging, with many survivors either avoiding intimacy entirely or falling into similarly controlling partnerships, their understanding of love distorted by early experiences. Parenting brought additional challenges, as women tried to raise children differently while processing their own trauma. Perhaps most pervasive was the religious trauma. Even those who rejected the belief system often struggled with deeply ingrained fears of divine punishment, apocalyptic thinking, and guilt over perceived spiritual failings. Recovery required not just physical escape, but a complete rebuilding of identity and worldview, a process that continued for years or decades. Yet Isabella also witnessed extraordinary healing among survivors who found appropriate support, many eventually becoming advocates helping others escape similar situations. For Isabella, the turning point came in her 5th year as a plural wife, when a federal raid on a neighboring settlement created unprecedented chaos in her community. With leaders temporarily detained and normal oversight disrupted, she seized the narrow window of opportunity to implement an escape plan she'd been mentally refining for years. With the help of 2 trusted sister wives who created a distraction, Isabella gathered her 2 young children and the small cache of supplies she'd gradually hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her quarters. Under cover of darkness, they slipped away through the settlement's eastern boundary, the least patrolled section due to rough terrain. What followed was 3 days of desperate travel, avoiding roads and settlements, surviving on foraged food and the small provisions she carried. Her destination was a women's shelter in a distant city, information passed to her years earlier by a sympathetic delivery driver. The journey tested every resource of strength and determination, particularly with a 4-year-old and toddler in tow. But the alternative, returning her daughters to the system that had claimed her own childhood, was unthinkable. When they finally reached the shelter, exhausted and frightened, Isabella spoke 7 words that changed their lives forever. "We escaped polygamy. Please help us hide." The shelter connected her with a support network of former plural wives who provided practical assistance and emotional understanding during those critical first months. Simple aspects of modern life, using a telephone, opening a bank account, applying for identification documents, required patience and guidance. Isabella found temporary work cleaning houses, one of the few skills from her former life that translated to employment opportunities. Her children struggled differently, the older one missing familiar surroundings while the younger adapted more quickly to their new life. Nights were the hardest, filled with nightmares and anxiety about being found and forced to return. The psychological conditioning of her upbringing didn't disappear with physical distance, with ingrained beliefs about her worth and purpose surfacing in unexpected moments. Most difficult was rebuilding her spiritual life, separating authentic faith from the manipulative religious teachings used to control her. Isabella found herself drawn to nature-based spirituality that honored feminine wisdom rather than suppressing it, gradually healing her relationship with the divine. Education became her passion, first obtaining her GED and eventually pursuing nursing studies, determined to help other women with the medical knowledge her community had deliberately withheld. 20 years after her escape, Isabella now leads one of the most effective underground railroads for women and children, fleeing polygamous communities throughout the American West. Her organization provides safe houses, legal assistance, education, job training, and psychological support, tailored to the unique needs of survivors. The work is dangerous. Fundamentalist groups actively search for escaped members and have threatened those who assist them. But Isabella finds purpose in offering others the help she once desperately needed. Her adult daughters work alongside her, the older one as a lawyer specializing in establishing legal identity for those without birth certificates or official records, the younger as a therapist helping children process their experiences. Most rewarding are the moments when newly escaped women realize they're truly free, that they own their bodies, minds, and futures for the first time. Isabella still carries the scars of her early life, visible in occasional nightmares and the vigilance that never fully subsides. But she has created something extraordinary from her suffering, a pathway to freedom for hundreds of women and children who might otherwise remain trapped in the same system that once claimed her. Her story represents both the devastating impact of religious polygamy on women's lives and the remarkable resilience of those who survive and transform their experiences into advocacy for others. What most outsiders fail to understand about polygamous communities is that they continue to exist throughout America, hiding in plain sight while adapting to modern scrutiny. Isabella's organization has identified dozens of active compounds across Utah, Arizona, Idaho, and into Canada, many operating under the guise of large extended families or religious communities. Modern polygamous groups have developed sophisticated methods to evade detection, including using corporate structures to obscure financial arrangements, homeschooling to limit outside contact with children, and utilizing technology selectively to maintain isolation while appearing contemporary. Some groups have adopted outward trappings of mainstream life, modern clothing, limited internet access, even occasional television, while maintaining the underlying patriarchal structure and plural marriage practices. Particularly concerning is the adaptation to legal challenges, with many groups no longer legally marrying additional wives, but conducting only religious ceremonies, technically complying with bigamy laws while continuing the practice in effect. This evolution makes intervention by authorities more difficult, as the line between religious freedom and abuse becomes increasingly blurred in legal terms. Isabella works closely with law enforcement and social services, providing cultural context and insider knowledge that helps identify and assist those in need of intervention. The stories of survivors reveal common themes across different polygamous groups, despite variations in specific religious teachings or community practices. Through her organization, Isabella has worked with women from diverse fundamentalist sects, finding striking similarities in their experiences. Control mechanisms remain remarkably consistent: isolation, limited education, economic dependence, fear of divine punishment, and separation of mothers from children. Modern plural wives may have smartphones and internet access, but these are typically monitored and restricted to approved content. What has changed least is the underlying power structure: older men maintaining control over young women's bodies, reproduction, and daily lives through religious authority and community pressure. Particularly heartbreaking are the intergenerational patterns, with mothers who were child brides watching their own daughters married off at similarly young ages, the cycle continuing despite legal prohibitions. Yet Isabella also sees hope in increasing awareness and resources for those seeking escape. Each year, more women and children find their way to freedom, often helping others follow the same path. These success stories slowly chip away at the foundations of polygamous communities, creating visible alternatives to the closed system and inspiring others to question teachings once accepted as divine truth. For those still trapped within polygamous marriages, Isabella offers a message of hope and practical guidance through carefully distributed materials and covert communications. Her organization maintains several seemingly innocuous websites that contain coded information about resources and escape planning, designed to avoid detection during routine monitoring of plural wives' limited internet access. Emergency contact information is disguised as recipes or craft instructions, while maps to safe locations appear as innocent travel blogs. Most effective are the former plural wives who maintain minimal contact with families still inside, serving as potential lifelines when someone decides to flee. Isabella has developed a risk assessment tool helping women evaluate when staying becomes more dangerous than the perils of escape, particularly in situations involving escalating abuse. Above all, her message emphasizes that freedom is possible despite the seemingly insurmountable barriers. The first step is allowing yourself to imagine another life, she explains to newly escaped women. Everything becomes possible once you truly believe you deserve freedom. This message, passed from survivor to survivor, has created ripples of change throughout communities designed to prevent exactly this kind of awakening. The broader societal implications of polygamous communities extend beyond the individuals directly involved, influencing surrounding communities and regional politics. Isabella's advocacy work includes educating law enforcement, social services, healthcare providers, and educators about recognizing signs of polygamous family structures and potential abuse. Particularly complex are the economic entanglements between polygamous groups and mainstream communities, with many polygamous men working in construction, mining, and other industries, while maintaining separate identities at home. Some larger groups have significant economic and political influence in rural areas, controlling local businesses and sometimes influencing local elections and policy. Isabella works to expose these connections without demonizing individual plural wives and children, who are themselves victims of the system. The long-term solution, she believes, lies not in dramatic raids that often cause additional trauma to women and children, but in sustainable interventions that provide genuine alternatives, educational opportunities, economic independence, and healing from religious trauma. Most important is breaking the isolation that perpetuates abuse, creating connections between plural wives and the outside world that offer glimpses of possible freedom. While Isabella's own story ended with successful escape and transformation, she acknowledges that many women make different choices based on their unique circumstances. Some plural wives, particularly older women with numerous children and grandchildren, choose to remain within their communities while secretly supporting those who wish to leave. Others negotiate improved conditions within their marriages, leveraging increased public scrutiny to gain more autonomy and better treatment. Some maintain their religious beliefs while rejecting the practice of polygamy, finding spiritual communities that support their faith journey without the controlling aspects of their former groups. Isabella's organization honors these diverse paths, offering support without judgment to women at various stages of questioning or leaving polygamous relationships. Freedom looks different for each woman, she often reminds her staff. Our job is to expand options, not dictate choices. This nuanced approach recognizes the complex reality that women in polygamous marriages are not simply passive victims, but individuals making difficult decisions within severely constrained circumstances. By respecting these women's agency while working to expand their choices, Isabella's organization has gained trust even among those not yet ready to leave entirely. The future of fundamentalist polygamy in America remains uncertain, with contradictory trends pointing toward both decline and adaptation. Isabella has witnessed significant changes during her decades of advocacy work, including increased public awareness, more effective law enforcement intervention, and growing networks of support for those seeking escape. Younger generations raised with even limited internet access have more opportunities to glimpse alternative lifestyles and question religious teachings, creating hairline fractures in once impenetrable belief systems. Legal developments, including stricter enforcement of age of consent laws and child welfare regulations, have forced some groups to modify their most extreme practices, particularly regarding underage marriage. Yet simultaneously, many polygamous communities have shown remarkable resilience and adaptability, evolving to present more acceptable public faces while maintaining fundamental power structures. Some groups have shifted toward less visible forms of control, replacing obvious physical isolation with sophisticated psychological manipulation that accomplishes the same purpose. Most concerning to Isabella is the emergence of new splinter groups with increasingly extreme beliefs, often forming after leadership disputes in established communities. These smaller, more radical groups typically seek even greater isolation and often implement stricter control measures, creating particularly dangerous situations for women and children. Looking toward the future, Isabella focuses on prevention alongside intervention, speaking at schools and universities about recognizing coercive control and religious manipulation. Particularly meaningful is her work with young women from vulnerable backgrounds who might be targeted by polygamous groups seeking new members. By sharing her story and those of other survivors, she illuminates the reality behind the romanticized vision of plural marriage sometimes portrayed in media. Isabella's greatest hope lies in education, not just formal schooling, though that remains essential, but education about healthy relationships, personal autonomy, and critical thinking about religious teachings. Her organization has developed age-appropriate materials for schools in regions where recruitment into polygamous communities occurs, helping young people recognize warning signs before becoming entrapped. Additionally, Isabella advocates for nuanced policy approaches that protect women and children, while avoiding unintended consequences that might drive polygamous groups into deeper isolation. Most fundamentally, she believes lasting change requires addressing the underlying conditions that make women vulnerable to these groups: poverty, limited educational opportunities, and cultural messages that define women's worth primarily through marriage and motherhood. Isabella's journey from child bride to powerful advocate represents a testament to human resilience and the capacity for transformation. At 64, she looks back on a life divided into distinct chapters: 14 years of childhood in a polygamous community, 5 years as a plural wife, and over 4 decades of freedom and advocacy work. The trauma of her early experiences never fully disappears, emerging in unexpected moments of vulnerability or triggering situations. Yet she has transformed these wounds into wisdom that guides her work and relationships. Most remarkable is her capacity for compassion, extending even to the community that harmed her and the man who took her childhood. Understanding the system doesn't mean excusing the abuse, she explains to new volunteers. It means recognizing that humans are capable of both terrible harm and extraordinary healing. This perspective informs her approach to working with both survivors and those still embedded in polygamous communities, seeing possibility for change even in seemingly hopeless situations. Isabella's legacy extends beyond the hundreds of women and children directly assisted by her organization, reaching into changed laws, institutional practices, and public understanding of religious polygamy's impact on women's lives. Her story continues to inspire others facing seemingly insurmountable circumstances, proving that even within the most controlling systems, the human spirit can find pathways to freedom.